बिस्मिल्लाहिर्रहमानिर्रहीम अस्सलाम वालेकुम। आज का टॉपिक है स्पेसिफिक लीव एक्ट 1877। इस एक्ट के कंप्लीट सेक्शंस विद इलस्ट्रेशन, टोटल एमसीक्यूज आपको मिलेंगे। हर इलस्ट्रेशन जिस जिस सेक्शन के साथ भी जितनी इलस्ट्रेशन दी गई हैं उन इलस्ट्रेशन में से भी एमसीक्यूज बनाए गए हैं, क्योंकि पेपर में मोस्ट प्रोबेबल चांसेस हैं कि इलस्ट्रेशन में से जो स्पेसिफिक रिलीफ एक्ट है, कॉन्ट्रैक्ट है, क्यूएसओ है, जिस एक्ट ने खुद इलस्ट्रेशन दी हुई है, तो इलस्ट्रेशन भी पार्ट ऑफ एक्ट होती हैं, तो फिर उसमें वो एमसीक्यूज उधर से आ सकते हैं। तो इसमें आपका कंप्लीट स्पेसिफिक रिलीफ एक्ट के एमसीक्यूज मिलेंगे। तो शुरू करते हैं जी। पहला क्वेश्चन है, स्पेसिफिक रिलीफ एक्ट 1877 वाज इनेक्टेड ऑन 7 फरवरी 1877 और इसकी इन्फोर्समेंट डेट जो है वो 1 मई 1877 है। वो दोनों डेट्स एमसीक्यूज में ऑप्शन में आपको देगा, तो आपको ये चीज याद रखनी है। Next is the primary purpose of the Specific Relief Act 1877 is to define and amend the law relating to certain kinds of specific relief obtainable in civil suits. Next is the according to the Act, the term obligation includes. Answer is every duty enforceable by law. Next is the term trust as defined in the Act encompass. Answer is every species of express, implied or constructive fiduciary relationship, ownership. Sorry. नेक्स्ट है जी, व्हेन डिड द स्पेसिफिक रिलीफ एक्ट 1877 केम इनटू फोर्स? 1 मई 1877। अच्छा जी, आगे है द सेक्शन डीलिंग विद द रिपील ऑफ इनेक्टमेंट्स इन स्पेसिफिक रिलीफ एक्ट 1877 सेक्शन 2 वाज रिपील्ड बाय द अमेंडिंग एक्ट 1891 12 ऑफ 1891। नेक्स्ट क्वेश्चन है जी, इन द इलस्ट्रेशन provided Z bequeaths land to A, not doubting that he will pay throughout thereout an annuity of rupees 1000 to B for his life. If A accepts the bequest, A is considered a trustee for B to the extent of the annuity because Z explicitly stated A is a trustee. Next is according to illustration B, if A legal advisor to B, gains a pecuniary advantage by availing himself of his situation, which might otherwise have accrued to B, A is considered a trustee for B. Such advantage, this illustration, the concept of इसका आंसर आपने कमेंट बॉक्स में करना है कि ये इलस्ट्रेशन जो है वो इसमें एक्सप्रेस ट्रस्ट की बात की गई, इम्प्लाइड ट्रस्ट अराइजिंग फ्रॉम अ फिड्यूशियरी रिलेशनशिप, या फिर कंस्ट्रक्टिव ट्रस्ट, या फिर टेस्टिमेंट्री ट्रस्ट की बात की गई है। पढ़ने से भी आंसर पता चल रहा है, लेकिन कुछ चीज़ें जो है वो कमेंट के लिए भी छोड़ देनी चाहिए ताकि पता चले कि आपने और से सुना है या नहीं सुना। आगे है जी 9, इन इलस्ट्रेशन डी, इफ ए द मॉर्गेजी ऑफ सर्टेन लीज होल्डर renews the lease in his own name, A is a trustee for those interested in the original lease. This scenario best demonstrates. Answer is constructive trust arising from the renewal of the property by someone in a fiduciary position. Next, the illustration G states that if A buys certain land with notice that B has already contracted to buy it, A is a trustee for B of the land so bought. This situation highlights. आंसर है इसका द इसका आंसर एक सेकेंड, द concept of a trust created by operation of law due to notice of prior equitable interest. Next is the term settlement in the Specific Relief Act 1877 refers to an instrument other than a will or codicil that disposes of or agrees to dispose of the destination or devolution of successive interest in movable or immovable property. Next is the all words occurring in the Specific Relief Act 1877 what are defined in the Contract Act 1872 shall be. Answer is C, respectively assigned to them by the Contract Act 1872. Next question is the sections 4 saving of the Specific Relief Act 1877 states that nothing in the act shall be deemed to give any right to relief in respect of any agreement which is not a contract. एक सेकेंड, हाँ जी नेक्स्ट क्वेश्चन देखते हैं। One of the saving clauses in Section 4 of the Specific Relief Act 1877 specifies that the Act does not deprive any person of any right to relief other than the specific performance which they may have under any contract. Next, according to Section 4C, the Specific Relief Act 1877 does not affect the operation of Indian Registration Act. Next है जी, which of the following is not a method by which specific relief is given under Section 5 of the Specific Relief Act 1877? Answer is by ordering a party to pay monetary compensation for damages. Next is specific relief granted under Class C of Section 5 is specifically referred to as preventive relief. Next, a specific relief cannot be granted for the mere purpose of enforcing a penal law. Next, a person entitled to the possession of specific immovable property may recover it in the manner prescribed by the Code of Civil Procedure. Next, under Section 9, if a person is dispossessed of immovable property without his consent, otherwise than in due course of law, he or any person claiming through him may recover possession by suit, notwithstanding any other title that may be set up. This suit is specifically for recovering possession based on prior possession. Next question is which of the following statements is true regarding a suit brought under Section 9 of the Specific Relief Act 1877? Answer is nothing in Section 9 bars any person from suing to establish his title to such property and to recover possession thereof. आगे है जी a suit under section 9 of the Specific Relief Act 1877 was previously required to be instituted within 6 months from the date of dispossession. The provision was repealed by the Repealing Act and Amending Act 1891. आगे है जी a person entitled to the possession of specific movable property may recover the same in the manner prescribed by the Code of Civil Procedure. अगला है according to explanation 1 of section 10, a trustee may sue for the possession of property if the beneficial interest belongs to the person for whom he is a trustee. Next है explanation 2 section 10 states that a suit under this section can be supported by a special or temporary right to the present possession of the property. Next question is in illustration B, a pledge jewels to B to secure a loan. B disposes of them prematurely. A sues B for possession without having paid or tendered the loan amount. The suit should be dismissed because A is not entitled to the present possession of the jewels. Next, the illustration C describes A receiving a letter from B and B letter taking it back without A's consent. A has such a property in the letter as entitles him to recover it from B. This highlights that the possession even of something like a letter can be a basis for recovery if answer option B there was no consent for its removal. Next in illustration a warehouse keeper is charged with the delivery of goods to Z, but B takes them out of A's possession. A may sue for the goods. This demonstrates that a person with what kind of right can sue for specific movable property. Answer is a mere possessory right based on responsibility. Next, under section 11, a person in possession or control of a particular article of movable property who is not the owner may be compelled to deliver it to the person entitled to immediate possession in all of the following cases except when the thing claimed is held by the defendant as a gift from the claimant. Next, according to section 11A, a person in possession of movable property not as owner can be compelled to deliver it if he holds it as the agent or trustee of the claimant. An illustration provided for this clause shows an agent pledging furniture without authority and the pledgee knowing of the lack of authority holding it as the owner's trustee. Again, in the illustration for class B of section 11, Z has possession of an idol belonging to A's family and A is the proper custodian. Z may be compelled to deliver the idol to A because compensation in money would not afford an adequate relief for the loss of the idol. Next, the illustration for class C of section 11 describes A being entitled to a picture by a dead painter and a pair of rare china vases. B has possession of them. B may be compelled to deliver them to A because it would be extremely difficult to ascertain the actual damage caused by their loss. आगे है जी section 11 primarily deals with the specific delivery of movable property when monetary compensation is not an adequate remedy or damages are difficult to ascertain. Next, the specific performance of a contract under Section 12 can be enforced by the court in its discretion except when pecuniary compensation for non-performance would not afford adequate relief. अगला है जी according to explanation to Section 12, the court shall presume that the breach of a contract to transfer immovable property cannot be adequately relieved by compensation in money unless the contrary is proved. आगे है जी इन द illustration for class B of section 12 A agrees to buy and B agrees to sell a picture by dead painter and two rare china vases. A can compel B to specifically perform the contract because there is no standard for ascertaining the actual damage caused by the non-performance. Next is the illustration for C of section 12 states that a railway company contracts with Z to build an archway, a road, pay annual maintenance, and construct a siding and wharf. Z is entitled to specific enforcement because his interest in its performance cannot be adequately compensated for by money. आगे है जी इन द illustration for class C regarding railway shares B can compel A to specifically perform the agreement to sell railway shares because the shares are limited in numbers and not always available in the market and their possession carries the standard of status of shareholder. Next है जी the explanation to section 12 also states that the breach of a contract to transfer movable property can be adequately relieved by compensation in money unless the contrary is proved. Again, in the illustration for class D, A transfers a promissory note to B without endorsement for valuable consideration. A becomes insolvent and C is appointed his assignee. B may compel C to endorse the note because C has succeeded to A's liability and a decree for pecuniary compensation would be fruitless. अगला है जी according to section 13 a contract is not wholly impossible of performance merely because a portion of its subject matter existing at its date has ceased to exist at the time of performance. The provision is made notwithstanding anything contained in section 56 of the contract act. Section 56 of the contract act deals with the agreement to do impossible acts. Under section 14, if a party to a contract is unable to perform the whole of his part, but the unperformed part is small in proportion to the whole in value and admits of monetary compensation, the court may direct specific performance of the part that can be performed and award compensation for the deficiency. अगला है जी इन illustration A for section 14 A contract to sell 100 bighas of land to B but 2 bighas belong to a stranger and cannot be conveyed if the 2 bighas are not necessary for the use of the 98 bighas and their loss can be made in good in money. Which of the following is a possible outcome? Answer is का B can compel A to convey the 98 bighas and get compensation for the remaining 2 bighas. Again, the section 15 deals with the situation where the unperformed part of the contract forms a considerable portion of the whole or does not admit of compensation in money. In such cases, the party in default, the one unable to perform the whole, is entitled to compensation from the other party. Again, under section 15, if the party in default is unable to perform a considerable portion, the other party, the plaintiff, may still seek specific performance of the part that can be performed, provided that the plaintiff relinquishes all claim to further performance and all right to compensation for the deficiency or loss. आगे है जी in illustration A for section 15 A contracts to sell 100 bighas to B but can only convey 50 bighas as the rest belong to a stranger. If B is willing to take the 50 bighas and waives all rights to compensation for the deficiency or loss, then answer is का B is entitled to a decree directing A to convey the 50 bighas on payment of the purchased money. आगे क्वेश्चन है जी इन illustration B for section 15 describes a contract for sale of an estate with a house and garden where the garden is important for the enjoyment of house. If A cannot convey the garden, A cannot obtain specific performance. However, if B is willing to take the estate and house without the garden and waives compensation, B is entitled to a decree directing to A to convey the house on payment of the purchase money. Again, according to section 16, if a party to a contract can and ought to be specifically performed and stands on a separate and independent footing from another part that cannot or ought not to be specifically performed, the contract may direct specific performance of the former enforceable part. Next, section 17 states that the court shall not direct the specific performance of a part of a contract except in cases falling under the थ्री लास्ट प्रीसीडिंग सेक्शन यानी कि 16 14 15 और 16 के में सिर्फ पार्ट परफॉर्मेंस हो सकती है, बाकी किसी भी सूरत में पार्ट परफॉर्मेंस नहीं हो सकती. Next is section 18 outlines the purchaser's right against the vendor with an imperfect title if the vendor subsequently acquires any interest in the property after the sale or lease. The purchaser or lessee may compel him to make good the contract of such acquired interest. Next is under section 18b if the concurrence of the person is necessary to validate the title and they are bound to convey the vendor's lesser request, the purchaser or lessee may compel the vendor or lessor to procure such concurrence. Next is section 18c. 18 subclass C addresses a situation where a vendor professes to sell unencumbered property but it is mortgaged for an amount not exceeding the purchase money. In the case, the purchaser may compel the vendor to redeem the mortgage and obtain a conveyance from the mortgagee. अगला है जी if a vendor or lessor sues for specific performance of a contract and the suit is dismissed due to his imperfect title as per section 18 clause D, the defendant purchaser or lessee has a right to a return of his deposit if any with interest his cost of the suit and a lien for such on the vendor's interest in the property. Next is the section 18 primarily deals with the rights of a purchaser or lessee when the vendor or lessor has a title that is imperfect and subject to defects. आगे है जी a person suing for specific performance of a contract according to section 19 may also seek for compensation for its breach. आंसर है इसका either in addition to or in substitution for specific performance. Next है जी if the court decides the specific performance ought not to be granted but finds that a contract has been broken by the defendant and the plaintiff is entitled to compensation, the court shall award compensation to the plaintiff accordingly. आगे जी if the court decides that specific performance ought to be granted but it is not sufficient to satisfy the justice of the case and some compensation for breach should also be made, the court shall award such compensation in addition to specific performance. Next is the explanation to section 19 clarifies that the court is not precluded from exercising its jurisdiction to award compensation even if the contract has become incapable of specific performance. अगला जी in the illustration for the second paragraph, a contract to sell rise to B sues for specific performance for compensation if the court finds a valid contract and breach but specific performance is not a proper remedy, the court shall award B such compensation as it deems just. Again, in the illustration for the third paragraph, A fails to sell a house to B, a contracted B sues for specific performance and compensation. If the suit is decided in B's favor, the decree may, besides ordering specific performance, award B compensation for any loss sustained by A's refusal. अगला है जी an illustration for the explanation involves a purchaser suing for specific performance of a contract for the sale of a patent but the patent expires before the hearing. In this scenario, the court may still award compensation for the non-performance. Next is when compensation is awarded under section 19, how is it assessed? In such a manner the court may direct. आगे है according to section 20, a contract that is otherwise proper to be specifically enforced may be thus enforced even if the contract names a sum to be paid in case of its breach and the defaulting party is willing to pay it. Next, the illustration for section 20 describes a contracting to grant an underlease and to apply for a necessary license, agreeing to pay rupees 10,000 if the license is not procured. If it refuses to apply and offers to pay rupees 10,000, B is still entitled to specific performance if C, the superior lessor, consents to give the license. Which of the following contracts cannot be specifically enforced under section 21? Answer है इसका contract for the non-performance of which compensation money is an adequate relief. आगे है जी a contract that runs into such minute or numerous details or is so dependent on the personal qualifications or volition of the parties or otherwise from its nature is such that the court cannot enforce specific performance of its material terms falls under which category of non-enforceable contracts in section 21. Section 21 की subclass B में fall करता है. Which of the following types of contracts is explicitly stated as not specifically enforceable under section 21 subclass E? A contract made by trustee either in excess of their power or in breach of their trust. Next है जी section 21 subclass G specifies that the contract performance of which involves the performance of a continuous duty extending over a longer period than 3 years from its date cannot be specifically enforced. Next, according to section 21 subclass H, a contract cannot be specifically enforced if a material part of its subject matter supposed by both parties to exist has before it has been made cease to exist. The principle is related to impossibility of performance arising after the contract is made. Next, the save as provided by the Arbitration Act 1940, no contract to refer present or future differences to arbitration shall be specifically enforced. However, if a person who has made such a contract refuses to perform it and sues in respect of the subject matter he contracted to refer, what is the consequences? Answer is that the existence of such a contract shall bar the suit. Next, that according to sell a contract to sell and buy a lakh rupees in the 4% loan of the federal government. Formally, central government cannot be specifically enforced because compensation in money would be an adequate relief. Next, a contract between A and author and B publisher for a complete literary work or agreeing to render personal services to B cannot be specifically enforced primarily due to which under section 21 it is dependent on the personal qualifications or volition of the parties. Again, if A and B contract to buy B's business at a valuation to be made by two valuers, but A instructs his valuer not to proceed before the valuation is made, specific performance cannot be enforced because the contract is revocable by nature, the terms are uncertain, it involves continuous duty, it runs into minute or numerous details that the court cannot enforce. Answer इसका D है. A contract where A lets land to B and B contracts to cultivate it in a particular manner for 3 years that after the date of the lease is generally not specifically enforceable because it involves a continuous duty extending over a period longer than 3 years. Next is a contract between A ownership of ship and B charter for the ship to load the cargo at Karachi and proceed to London with freight paid in installments cannot be specifically enforced because it involves a continuous duty. आगे है जी if a company exists solely for making a working a railway contracts for the purchase of land to erect a cotton mill, this contract cannot be specifically enforced because it is in excess of the company's power. आगे है जी a contract to marry B cannot be specifically enforced because it is dependent on the personal qualifications or volition of the parties. Next है जी if a material part of the subject matter of a contract e.g. an annuity of for the lives of C and D where C was dead at the date of the consent through supposed alive by both parties has ceased to exist before the contract was made. The contract cannot be specifically enforced according to which clause of section 21 clause 21 की clause H subject matter ceased to exist before contract. Next is a contract by directors of a company to sell the concern without the required sanction of a general meeting of shareholders cannot be specifically enforced because it is made in excess of their powers. A contract where two trustee empowered to sell trust property worth a lakh of rupees contract to sell it for rupees 30,000 at advantageous price amounting to a breach of trust cannot be specifically enforced because it is made by the trustee in breach of trust. Next is the jurisdiction to decree specific performance as per section 22 is discretionary, sound, reasonable, guided by judicial principles and capable of correction by a court of appeal. अगला है the court may properly exercise a discretion not to decree specific performance in which of the following scenarios. Answer is का where the circumstances under which the contract is made given the plaintiff an unfair advantage over the defendant even without fraud or misrepresentation. Answer है in illustration B under section 22 L A contracts to sell the B the interest of C in certain stock in trade knowing that C is heavily in debt a factor known to be specific performance should be refused to A because it would give A an unfair advantage over B. Illustration C under section 22 describes a contracting to sell land to B, concealing the necessity of maintaining an expensive embankment to protect it from floods. A factor unknown to B specific performance should be refused to A due to an unfair advantage gained by A due to the concealment. Next is G. Which of the following is a case where the court may properly exercise a discretion not to declare specific performance due to hardship on the defendant? Section 22, Clause 2. When the performance of the contract would involve some unforeseen hardship on the defendant, while non-performance would not cause such hardship on the plaintiff. अगला है जी in illustration F under section 22 2 and A and B trustees and their beneficiaries C contract to sell the trust state to D agreeing to exonerate it from heavy encumbrances. The purchase money is sufficient to discharge these encumbrances through the vendors believed it sufficient. Specific performance should be refused to D because it would involve unforeseen hardships on the vendors. अगला जी इन illustration H under section 22 states that a contract to sell land and make a road to it. If making the road would expose A to litigation, specific performance of the part relating to the road should be refused to B even if he is entitled to specific performance of the rest with compensation. The illustration refusal the illustrates refusal to hardship involving litigation. अगला है जी अकॉर्डिंग टू सेक्शन 22 क्लास 3 ये पार्ट है इस केस में 1 2 3 पार्ट्स बने हुए सेक्शन 22 के तो थर्ड पार्ट में जो है ना द कोर्ट में प्रॉपरली एक्सरसाइज द डिस्क्रिप्शन टू डिक्रीज स्पेसिफिक परफॉर्मेंस इन विच ऑफ द फॉलोइंग केसेस वेयर द प्लेंटिफ हैज डन सब्सटेंशियल एक्ट और सफर्ड लॉस इन consequences of a contract capable of specific performance. अगला है जी in the illustration for section 22 part 3 a railway company contracts to execute certain works for A's convenience for buying land from A. If the company takes the land and uses it for the railway specific performance of the contract to execute the works should be declared in favor of A because A has done substantial act sold in the land in consequence of the contract. Again, according to section 23, who among the following can generally obtain specific performance of a contract? Any party thereto or their representative in interest or principal with provisos. आगे है जी under section 23 class B when can a representative in interest or principal of a party not be entitled to specific performance even if otherwise allowed? Answer है इसका B when the learning skill solvency or any personal quality of the original party is material ingredient in the contract. अगला है जी if a contract is a settlement on marriage or a compromise of doubtful rights between members of the same family who can obtain specific performance according to section 23 subclass C. Any person beneficiary entitled thereunder. अगला है जी when a public company enters into a contract and subsequently amalgamates with another public company who can obtain specific performance of the original contract according to section 23 subclass G. Answer है इसका B the new company which arises out of the amalgamation. Again, under section 24, specific performance of a contract cannot be enforced in favor of a person who could not recover compensation for its breach. आगे है जी illustration to class B of section 24. A contracts to sell B a house and becomes its tenant for 14 years. If A becomes insolvent, why can neither A nor his assignee enforce specific performance of the contract because A has become incapable of performing an essential term, solvency for tenancy. Next, in an illustration for section 24B, A contracts to sell B a house and garden with ornament trees a material element. If A without B's consent falls the trees, A cannot enforce specific promise because A has violated an essential term of the contract that remained to be performed. Again, according to section 24 subclass C, specific performance cannot be enforced in favor of a person who has already chosen his remedy and obtained satisfaction for the alleged breach of the contract. Next, in the illustration for section 24 subclass C, A contracts to let a house to B and B refuses to perform. If A then sues for A and obtains compensation for the breach, can subsequently obtain specific performance of the contract? No, because A has already chosen his remedy and obtained satisfaction. आगे है जी section 24 subclass D bars specific performance in favor of a person who previously to the contract had noticed that the settlement of the subject matter thereof thought not founded on any valuable consideration had been made and was then enforced. The provision protects prior existing settlement or arrangements. Next, according to section 25, subclass A, a contract for the sale or letting of property cannot be specifically enforced in favor of a vendor or lessor who knew himself not to have any title to the property when contracting to sell or let it. Next, in illustration B for section 25, trustees are bequeathed land with power to sell with B's written consent. B gives a general perspective assent. The trustee contract with C to sell the land, but C refuses. The trustee cannot specifically enforce the contract because B's general consent is not sufficient for a title free from reasonable doubt for the specific sale. Again, the section 25C states that a contract cannot be specifically enforced in favor of a vendor or lessor who, previous to entering into the contract, has made a settlement of the subject matter of the contract, even if the settlement was not founded on any valuable consideration. Again, in illustration D, for section 25, A makes a settlement of property on his brothers and their issues of out of natural love and affection, and then contracts to sell the property to a stranger. A cannot enforce specific performance against the stranger because it would override the settlement and prejudice the interest of those claiming under it. Section 26 deals with the specific performance of a contract where the defendant sets up variation. In such cases, the plaintiff cannot obtain the performance sought except with the variation if by fraud, mistake, or fact the written contract is different from what the defendant supposed it to be. Next, under section 26, subclass B, if the defendant entered into the contract under a reasonable misapprehension as to its effect between himself and the plaintiff due to fraud, mistake of fact, or surprise, the specific performance sought by the plaintiff will only be granted with the variation set up by the defendant. Next, again, illustration C for section 26 describes a contracting in writing to let a wharf with the delineated strip of land to be. Before signing, B orally proposed substituting another strip to which A assented. If B signed the written contract, A cannot obtain specific performance of the contract except with the variation set up by B because B relied upon a stipulation by the plaintiff A that adds to the contract. Again, if the parties to a contract have subsequently to its execution contract contracted to vary its section 26E and plaintiff seeks specific performance of the original written contract, the court will likely grant specific performance only with the subsequent variation. Again, according to section 27B, specific performance of a contract may be enforced against any other person claiming under a party to the contract by a title arising subsequently to contract except a transferee for value who has paid his money in good faith and without notice of the original contract. Again, in illustration for section 27B, A contracts to sell land to B and later conveys it to C who has notice of the original contract. B may enforce specific performance of the contract against C. Next, if A contracts to sell land to B and B takes the possession but A then sells it to C, who makes no inquiry for of B's possession is sufficient to affect C with notice of his interest. In this scenario, B can enforce specific performance against C. This illustrates the principle of caveat emptor. Under section 27C, specific performance can be enforced against the person claiming under the title which through prior to the contract and known to the plaintiff might have been displaced by the defendant. Again, in an illustration for section 27C, a life tenant with remainder to be contracts to sell the estate to C in due exercise of parts and C has notice of the settlement. If A dies before completion, C may enforce specific performance against B, the remainder man. Again, when the promoters of a public company have before its incorporation entered into a contract for the purpose of the company can have specific performance of force only against if section 27E the company has ratified and adopted the contract and it is warranted by the terms of the incorporation. Section 27A applies to a contract or to lease immovable property made in writing and signed by the parties. It allows the specific performance notwithstanding that the contract through required to be registered has not been registered provided there is a part performance of the contract. आगे है जी if specific performance of a contract to lease is claimed by the lessor under section 27A, what condition must be regarding the part performance? The lessor must have delivered possession of the property to the lessee in part performance of the contract. आगे है जी in section 27A which deals with specific performance in the case of part of performance of a contract lease was inserted into the Specific Leave Act 1877 by an amendment with effect from 1st April 1930. What rights are not affected by Section 27A regarding part performance of a contract to lease? The rights of a transferee for consideration who has no notice of the contract or part of the performance of thereof. Again, according to Section 28, specific performance of a contract cannot be enforced against a party if the consideration to be received by him is so grossly inadequate with reference to state of things existing at the date of the contract as to be evident of fraud or undue advantage taken by the plaintiff. Again, the specific performance cannot be enforced against a party if his assent to the contract was obtained by all of the following except a promise by the other party which has not been substantially fulfilled. Under Section 28C, if the parties assent given under the influence of mistake, effect, misrepresentation, or surprise, specific performance typically cannot be enforced. However, what a proviso to this rule. If the contract provides for compensation in case of mistake, compensation may be made and the contract specifically enforced in other respects. अगला है in the illustration for section 28C, a one of two executors erroneously believes he has the authority of his co-executor and he enters into an agreement to sell testator's property to B. Why B cannot insist on the sale being completed because A's assent was given under the influence of mistake of fact. Next, another illustration for section 28C states that A directs an auctioneer to sell land but then revokes authority as to 20 because the auctioneer inadvertently sells the whole to B who has no notice of the revocation. Why can B not enforce specific performance of the agreement for the entire land? Answer is because the auctioneer acted without A's full consent due to mistake या फिर surprise. Section 28 is primarily concerned with circumstances that make the enforcement of specific performance. Answer है इसका unjust or inequitable against the defendant. अगला क्वेश्चन है जी according to section 29 what is the consequence of dismissal of a suit for specific performance of a contract or part thereof? Answer है इसका the plaintiff's right to sue for compensation for the breach is barred. आगे है जी section 29 essentially implements the principle of res judicata as it relates to remedies. Next, section 30 states that the provision of this chapter of specific performance contracts regarding contracts shall mutatis mutandis applies to awards and to directions in a will or codicil to execute a particular settlement. Next, the phrase mutatis mutandis in section 30 means with the necessary changes being made. Next, if a will contains a direction to execute a particular settlement, how will the provision regarding specific performance of a contract apply to this discretion? They will apply with the necessary changes in points of details. आगे है जी under section 31 an instrument writing may be ratified when through fraud or mutual mistake of the parties it does not truly express their intention who may institute a suit for rectification. Next है जी either party or his representative in interest. अगला है जी the court's discretion to rectify an instrument under section 31 is subject to condition that it can be done without prejudice to rights acquired by third persons in good faith and for value. आगे है जी in illustration A for section 31 A intends to sell his house and one go down to B but through B's fraud the conveyance includes all three go downs. B gives one fraudulently included go down to C and lets another to D. Neither C nor D knowing of the fraud against whom can the conveyance be rectified? Against B and C but not D. आगे है जी for the purpose of rectifying a contract in writing section 32 mandates that the court must be satisfied that all the parties thereto intended to make an equitable and conscientious agreement. अगला है जी when rectifying a written instrument section 33 states that the court is not confined to in inquiring what language of the instrument was intended to be but may also inquire into what the instrument was intended to mean and what were intended to be its legal consequences. Again, according to section 34, a contract in writing may be first rectified and then specifically enforced provided that the plaintiff has so prayed in his plaint and the court thinks fit. आगे है जी इन द इलस्ट्रेशन फॉर सेक्शन 34 ए कॉन्ट्रैक्ट्स इन राइटिंग टू पे हिज अटॉर्नी टू बी a fixed sum the contract contains mistake as to the client's name and rights which would be excluded b from all rights b is entitled to have it rectified and an order of payment as if the time of its execution it had expressed the intention of the party that demonstrate the rectification aims to align with the document with actual intention of the party. Again, according to section 35A, a contract in writing may be rescinded by the court if the contract is voidable or terminable by the plaintiff. Again, in illustration A for section 35A sells a field to B concealing a known right of way over it. B is entitled to have a contract rescinded because A's concealment makes the contract voidable by B. Next is section 35B allows for rescission of a contract if it is unlawful for causes not apparent to its face and the defendant is more to blame than the plaintiff. Again, according to section 35 subclass C, if a decree for specific performance of a contract of sale or lease has been made and the purchaser or lessee makes default in payment of the purchase money or other sum, the court may order him to pay the rents and profits if in wrongful possession or and rescind the contract. Next, section 36 states that the decision of a contract cannot be adjudged for mere mistake unless the party against whom it is adjudged can be restored to substantially the same position as if the contract had not been made. Next, under section 37, a plaintiff suing for specific performance of a contract in writing may make an alternative prayer that if specifically performance cannot be enforced, the contract may be rescinded and delivered up for cancellation. आगे है जी when the court adjusts the rescission of a contract section 38 allows it to require the party to whom such relief is granted to make any compensation to the other which justice may require. Next is the words or writing in section 35 and 36 regarding the contract rescission were repealed wherever which act is enforced in the Indian Contract Act 1872. आगे जी अंडर सेक्शन 39 any person against whom a written instrument is void or voidable and who has reasonable apprehension that it may cause him serious injury is left outstanding the may sue to have it. And option B है जी adjudged void or voidable and order to be delivered up and cancelled. आगे है जी if an instrument order for cancellation under section 39 has been registered what additional step shall the court take? It will send copy of its decree to the officer in whose office the instrument was registered and that officer shall note the cancellation in his books. आगे है जी in illustration B for section 39 A conveys land to B who bequeaths it to C. D gets possession and produces a forged instrument stating the conveyance to B was in trust for him who may obtain the cancellation of the forged instrument. Answer is C. The person to whom B bequeaths the land. आगे है जी illustration C for section 39 describes A fraudulently granting a registered lease of part of his land to C dated prior to his sale of the land to B. B may obtain the cancellation of his lease because it is voidable instrument causing him serious injury if left outstanding. अगला है जी according to section 40 if an instrument is evidence of different rights or obligations the court may in a proper case cancel it only partially allowing it to stand for the residue. आगे है जी in the illustration for section 40 a bill is drawn on B endorsed to C then E but C endorsement is forged. C is entitled to have the forged endorsement cancelled. Leave the bill to stand in other aspects. This demonstrates the principle of partial cancellation of the instrument. On adjudging the cancellation of an instrument, Section 41 empowers the court to require the party to whom such relief is granted to answer C, make any compensation to the other which justice may require. अगला क्वेश्चन है जी, अकॉर्डिंग टू सेक्शन 42 सब क्लास 1 एनी पर्सन इंटाइटल्ड टू एनी कैरेक्टर or any right to any property may institute a suit against any person denying or interested to deny his title to such character or right, and the court may in its discretion make therein a declaration that he is so entitled. What further relief is generally required to be sought by the plaintiff in such a suit? Answer है B. The plaintiff need not to ask for any further relief. एक second. अगला क्वेश्चन है, द प्रोविजन टू सेक्शन 42 सब क्लास 1 states that no court shall make any such declaration where the plaintiff being able to seek further relief than a mere declaration of title does but omits to do so. आगे क्वेश्चन है, एज पर सेक्शन 42 सब क्लास 2 a suit filed under subsection 1 for a declaration of states status or right shall be decided by a court dealing within the dash year. According to section 42 subclass 2, an appellate court shall decide an appeal related to a suit or declaration status of right or section आगे है, a declaration made under chapter 6 of the specific relief act section 43 is binding on all of the following except persons for whom the parties if trustees would be trustee if the existence at the date of declaration any person in the world whether involved in the suit or not. Next question, in the illustration for section 43, A seeks a declaration that his marriage was duly solemnized and an order for restitution of conjugal rights against B, his alleged wife and her mother. The court makes the declaration and order if C claiming B his wife then sues A for recovery of B. The declaration made in former suit is not binding upon C. Next, the primary purpose of Section 42 is to allow a person to seek a declaration for their character or right when it is being denied or there is an interest to deny it. Again, the appointment of a receiver pending a suit as per Section 44 is matter resting in the discretion of the court. Next, the mode and effect of receiver's appointment and his rights, power, duties, and liabilities are regulated by the Code of Civil Procedure. Next, the chapter 8 of the Specific Relief Act, which deals with of the enforcement of public duties, has been omitted by the federal laws revision and declaration ordinance 1981. Again, the omission of chapter 8 of the Specific Relief Act 1877 means that the provision related to the enforcement of public duties are no longer found within this specific act. This omission occurred due to the federal laws revision and declaration ordinance 1981. Next, which of the following statements about the appointment of a receiver under the Specific Relief Act 1877 is true? The court has the flexibility to decide whether to appoint a receiver or not. अगला है, according to section 52, preventive relief is granted at the discretion of the court by injunction, temporary or perpetual. Next, section 53 defines temporary injunction as those that continue until the specific time for or further order of the court. They are regulated by the Code of Civil Procedure 1908. Next, a perpetual injunction can only be granted by the decree made at the hearing and upon the merits of the suit. Its purpose is to perpetually enjoin the defendant from the assertion of a right or the commission of an act which would be contrary to the rights of the plaintiff. Next, under section 54, a perpetual injunction may be granted to prevent the breach of an obligation existing in favor of the applicant, whether expressly or by implication. When such an obligation arises from contract, the court shall be guided by the rules and supervisions contained in Chapter 2 of this Act specific performance of the contract. Next, when the defendant invades or threatens to invade the plaintiff's right to enjoyment of property, a perpetual injunction may be granted in all or of the following cases except where the invasion is such that pecuniary compensation would not afford adequate relief. आगे है जी, for the purpose of section 54, the explanation clarifies that a trademark is considered property. अगला, in illustration B or under section 54, if a trustee threatens a breach of trust, who may sue for an injunction to prevent the breach? His co-trustees, if any, and the beneficial owners. Next, the illustration C under section 54 states that if directors of a public company are about to pay a dividend out of capital or borrowed money, any of the shareholders may sue for an injunction to restrain them. This is an example of an injunction granted to prevent a breach of contractual obligation. Next, in illustration H under section 54A, a vakil threatens to make public papers belonging to his client B. B may sue for an injunction to restrain A from doing so because it is contrary to A's duty implied obligation of confidentiality. Next, in illustration 5 of section under section 54 means that A pirates B's copyright. B may obtain an injunction to restrain the piracy unless the work of which copyright is claimed is libelous or obscene. Next question is according to section 55, a mandatory injunction can be granted when to prevent the breach of an obligation. It is necessary to compel the performance of certain acts which the court is capable of enforcing. अगला क्वेश्चन है जी इन illustration A for section 55 A's new buildings obstructs B's lights. B may obtain an injunction to not only restrain A from building but also to pull down so much of the buildings as obstructs B's lights. Next है जी section 56 lists several situations where an injunction cannot be granted. Which of the following is not such? One such situation to stay a judicial proceeding pending at the institution of the suit unless necessary to prevent a multiplicity of the proceeding. अगला क्वेश्चन है जी एन इंजंक्शन कैन नॉट बी ग्रांटेड अंडर सेक्शन 56D टू इंटरफेयर विद द पब्लिक ड्यूटीज ऑफ एनी डॉक्यूमेंट ऑफ फेडरल गवर्नमेंट और एनी प्रोविंशियल गवर्नमेंट और विद द sovereign acts of foreign government. Next, under section 56F, an injunction cannot be granted to prevent the breach of contract, the performance of which would not be specifically enforced. Next, section 56I states that an injunction cannot be granted when equally efficacious relief can certainly be obtained by any other usual mode of proceeding breach of trust, except in cases of breach of trust. Again, illustration B for section 56, A manufactures sells crucibles as patent plum bago crucibles, but they are not patent. If B pirates the designation, A cannot obtain an injunction because the crucibles are a common product. Next, section 57 injunction to perform negative agreement provides an exception to section 56 clause F. It states that where a contract comprises an affirmative agreement coupled with an negative agreement, the inability to compel specific performance of the affirmative agreement shall not preclude the court from granting an injunction to perform the negative agreement, provided that the applicant has not failed to perform the contract so far as it is binding on him. In illustration A for section 57, A contract to sell goodwill of a business and agrees not to carry on that business in Karachi. A carries on the business. The contract cannot compel A to send customers to B, but B may obtain an injunction restraining from carrying on the business in Karachi. Next question is in illustration C section 57 A contracts with B to sign for 12 months at B's theatre and not to sing in a public elsewhere. B cannot obtain specific performance for the contract to sing affirmative but is entitled to an injunction restraining A from singing at any other place of public entertainment negative. आगे इसके आंसर कीज हैं वो सारे आंसर मैं ऑलरेडी बता चुकी हूँ तो उसको अगर ये पीडीएफ में किसी को चाहिए तो कमेंट सेक्शन में लिख दें तो पीडीएफ अवेलेबल हो जाएगी। थैंक यू सो मच फॉर लिसनिंग। अल्लाह हाफिज़।